Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tyler Chrestman, and welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. This week on the podcast, we are talking about what has become my personal crusade, and something I highlight quite often on the podcast, and we talk about a lot. We're going to talk about cancel culture and why it's in the news again this week, as it is quite often in the circles in which I travel. This week, the renowned public intellectual Jordan Peterson was in the news because he had another run-in with cancel culture. For those who don't know who Jordan Peterson is, I would, first of all, encourage you to go check him out. He is quite awesome, but a brief little biography of who this man is. He's a doctor of psychology, taught at Harvard for a long time, and has been at the University of Toronto for about the past 20 years. A few years ago, he wrote one of the best-selling nonfiction books and was so famous that even the New York Times called him one of the most important public intellectuals in the world. Little quick bio. He came to prominence back in 2016 when he stood up against Bill C-16 in Canada. Now, Bill C-16 in Canada was a modification of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. I believe that's what they call it up there. It basically moved to criminalize intentionally misgendering trans people. Now, the best practice when dealing with any trans individual is to just use their pronouns. Now, you don't have to acknowledge you don't have to get into the controversy. Just don't be rude to people. And that's what he said. He said if a trans person took his class, for example, biological female wished to be called he, there's no objection to that. The problem with the bill was that what it did was it actually compelled speech. It actually made it illegal to say things that the Canadian government basically said, no, this is not acceptable. And so that was where the controversy stemmed from. It was basically a controversy of, can the government compel speech? And he and I myself come down firmly on the side of nope, you should not compel speech. Anyway, that was the thing that brought him to prominence. He then wrote this book, which sold 3 million copies, probably more at this point. The last time I remember looking, it had sold over 3 million copies, and he launched a world tour. He was probably the only, I would imagine, and I honestly don't know this for a fact, but I could imagine that there has not been a book tour that sold more tickets than the Jordan Peterson book tour, maybe ever. He sold out cities all over the world, and he went on tour for basically 2 years. It was incredible. I went to see him in St. Louis with a couple friends of mine, and it was awesome. Because of this misunderstanding of his position on Bill C-16 and some of the other things that he has said, he has had some of the worst media coverage in the most disingenuous media coverage of all time. All you got to do is look at the New York Times and some of the hit pieces they wrote on him that are just, for anyone who's ever followed his work, just so far removed from the truth. It's insane. And another thing that made him pretty famous was this interview he did with this woman named Kathy Newman, which is one of the greatest examples of how bad, quote unquote, journalism can be. Because he would say something like, my favorite color is red. And she would do this thing. And you watch when people do this. This is a terrible way that people argue. She would do this thing where she said, well, so what you're saying is you really like blue. And so it's this idea. He would say something, and then she would take it and just make it seem like he was saying whatever she wanted him to say. So, and he just laughed, and it just was an awful 30 minutes. I encourage everyone to go watch this interview, the Kathy Newman, Jordan Peterson interview, and you will see exactly what I'm talking about, because it's the most blatant example of how bad people can be at arguing without even realizing how bad they are. It's this idea of straw manning every position your opponent holds. You're just taking it and not attacking what they say, not arguing against what they say, but instead arguing against the straw man that you create. So anyway, there's a little bit of a biography. He's a member of the intellectual dark web, or he was when that was still a thing, but that's a whole nother topic. Well, why are we talking about him today? So he's been gone for almost 2 years. He's been dealing with some very serious health problems. When he was doing his book tour around the world, his wife got very sick. He started to deal with some very serious anxiety issues, and he basically got hooked on benzos, and he's been detoxing for about 2 years on benzos, which for anyone who's familiar with it is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It is not fun at all. And so he had some very serious complications as a result of that. And he's been gone for 2 years. He just recently in the past month posted his first video on his YouTube channel, which is part of the reason why he got famous, was starting a YouTube channel around 2016. And he just posted his first video for the first time in 2 years. And it was really glad to see him back. He's a very important figure that we could definitely use right now. And he came back to announce that he has written a sequel for his book. It's called Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, I believe is the subtitle, 12 More Rules for Life, because his first book was called 12 Rules for Life. And now here's the relevant part why we're talking about him. Today, when Penguin Publishing House Canada announced that they were going to publish what is very likely to be an incredibly successful book, there was basically a soft coup among their workers. The company had to have what they call, this is the quote, an emotional town hall, where dozens of the staffers who worked for Penguin House Publishing filed anonymous complaints about the company's decision to publish the book. So some of the staff reported that there were multiple people, who wound up crying at this event. They were so affected by this. People were crying at a publishing house because the publisher decided to publish a book, and it made them cry. Okay. An unnamed employee who is a member of the LGBT community told Vice News that Jordan Peterson, this is a quote, Jordan Peterson is an icon of hate speech and transphobia. And the fact that he's an icon of white supremacy, regardless of the content of his book, I'm not proud to work for a company that publishes him, end quote. These people live in a fantasy world. This is the problem with the more radical end of leftism. Every person who doesn't believe or completely align with their views is a white supremacist. If you think that Jordan Peterson is a white supremacist, you are either unfamiliar with him and you've just listened to what other people have said, or you're a crazy person. And there is no other option. If you can misconstrue the things that man says, and the fact that he has denounced racism and white supremacy multiple times in his life, like the idea that because some people who are on the conservative right like his work, that he must be a white supremacist. It's pervasive in the more radical ends of leftism, and it is just so toxic for anything that any hope we have of rational discussion. He's not a transphobe. He said multiple times that if a trans person wishes to be called by the certain pronouns, whatever it is, he would do that. The only thing that he's against is compelled speech by the government, which is a good thing. We shouldn't be allowing the government to dictate the words that we have to say. They shouldn't dictate the words that we can't say, except in extreme cases. You shouldn't. The limitations that we have on free speech in this country right now, you cannot openly threaten people, because that is assault. You can't do it. You cannot threaten to harm somebody. You cannot directly call for violence against a person. That's a good rule. Libel and slander, those are good rules. If you are intentionally lying to damage the reputation of others, or even sometimes I think unintentionally, if you are a publication, for example, and you publish a piece that turns out to be false and it damages the reputation of a public individual, you are then subject to libel laws, and those are fine laws. What we do not have are any codes against hate speech, and this is actually a good thing. People shouldn't talk hatefully to one another. I think everyone can agree on this, but we cannot have the government restricting speech, and that's all that Jordan Peterson has ever stood up against. Now, people at a publishing house saying that we shouldn't publish a book because some of the ideas in there we don't agree with. First of all, anyone who read his first book knows that it is not that controversial. It really is not. There's not a lot in there He talks about hierarchies a lot. He talks about male-female relationships a lot. And he has a doctorate in clinical psychology. He's been a clinician for, I think, the last 20 or 30 years. He knows a lot about the way that people, the minds of people work. And he knows that one thing that is really unfortunate to have to acknowledge, there are differences between men and women. And this is something that he talks about a lot. Not that one is better than the other. Certainly, women are better at certain things than men, and men are better at certain things than women. But the idea on the more radical fringes of the left is that there is no difference between men and women, and that it's all a social construct, this postmodernism garbage that we should have rejected outright and now has become more mainstream in progressivism. This idea that every hierarchy we have, every difference between male and female, the roles that people play in society, all these things are just social constructs that have no biological basis. Well, it's all just, it's nonsense, but that's a topic for another time. A deconstruction of postmodernism would be, it's very necessary at this point. Anyway, so here's the point. Here's why we're talking about this. Jordan Peterson is a prime example of a person who should not be considered a radical, yet people try to paint him as a radical. And this is a great example of where cancel culture gets everything incredibly wrong. People you disagree with should not be deplatformed or silenced. You meet bad ideas with good ideas. I think Jordan Peterson actually has a lot of really good ideas. The New York Times and Vice and these other news organizations have maligned him, in my opinion, very unfairly. One of the hit pieces that the New York Times put out about him really damaged my trust in that institution to hold their journalists to any sort of account. It was one of the worst pieces of journalism I've read in the last 10 years. And it really damaged my faith in the New York Times. Jordan Peterson is not a radical, but people attempt to paint him as a radical. And in an attempt to do so and silence their opponents, what they're attempting to do is close the Overton window. Now, those who don't know what the Overton window is, that is the topics which are considered acceptable for discussion and debate among the public. So imagine there's a giant list of things that you are allowed to debate and have differing opinions on and still be considered a member of society that should be treated with respect. Now, what would be something that would be outside the Overton window? If you stood up in the United States today, 2020, and you were openly advocating that we should bring slavery back, I think we all agree that's outside the Overton window. That person doesn't need to be taken seriously, and they don't need to be treated with respect because that idea is so toxic and so anathema to our way of life in this country that we would not have to take that person seriously. Now, when you're debating something like Bill C-16 and you're talking about the pronouns of trans people, this is something that is, there are people on both sides of this issue who are not transphobic, they're not bigots, but they have concerns about certain issues. But what people want to say is, well, we don't have to talk to them because they're hate mongers, they're bigots, and we don't need to discuss them. We can just shut them out of polite society. And what you're finding is that a lot of things that are mainstream conservative positions, the left attempts to do this too. You can't talk about immigration. You can't talk about the differences between men and women. You can't say there's no patriarchy. You can't say systemic racism is not real in the United States. You cannot say these things because the left will attempt to paint you in a way that is the modern day equivalent of a tar and feathering and run you out of town. They'll mob you on Twitter if you have if you're Mario Lopez and you say that, hey, I don't think that children should make decisions about their lives that are going to affect them the rest of their lives. I don't think that we should give children hormone blockers. If you're Mario Lopez and you say that, well, congratulations, you're the worst person in the world according to the progressive left, and we're going to try and cancel your show and run you off television forever. These things that are really, really sensitive, delicate questions that need to be discussed openly and honestly, the left is not interested in debate. The far left is not interested in debate. They're interested in shutting down their opponents. And if you don't agree with them, they're interested in calling you a bad person. But there's no debate among progressives anymore. It's all about silencing the opposition, because the opposition sometimes is full of facts and not just emotional appeals. And they're not interested in facts that don't conform to their postmodern worldview, because sometimes a fact is just a social construction. It's not actually there's no actual biological difference, just a social construction. The fact that men and women fall into similar roles throughout society, culture, and history, well, that's just an inconvenient fact. It's not, there's nothing about that is based in reality. It's just all made up social hierarchies by the patriarchy. Okay, crazy people. Anyway, now the important thing to remember from this podcast today is that most people in the country are not aware of how pervasive this problem is, because it doesn't affect them on their daily lives. Except you're seeing that people are waking up. They're waking up to how this culture of fear and intimidation, which is what the left does. They silence people by intimidating them. There are people who go to work, and you'll see polls about this. They're afraid to voice opinions. You have half the country that voted for Donald Trump. He got 70-something million votes, the second most votes for president ever. And you see people who say every single person who voted for Donald Trump is racist. You see this on Twitter a lot. You see all these people who, every single of the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump is a racist. They're a bigot. They're beyond help. We need to excise them from the country. We need a complete demolition of the Republican Party. And this is now, it's really trickling down to the regular person in the office who, they realize now that when they go to work, they're afraid to voice an opinion because they're afraid of the repercussions that might happen. You know, you have to sit through a diversity training. And let's say that you're sitting through this thing and they're making giant claims about what it means to be white and privileged, and how there's racism in the system, and how we all need to, you're either racist or anti-racist, the Ibram Max Kendi kind of nonsense, the Robin DiAngelo white fragility garbage, this whole idea that is trickling into the mainstream. Well, you're seeing more and more people are now being confronted with it in their lives. People like myself who have been into this issue for years and years and years. I wrote about cancel culture all the way back in 2015 when I was talking about Alan West coming to SLU's campus and being protested. This issue has been the core of my fight against the members of the socialist left for a long time. But now you're seeing it trickle into the mainstream. And I'm hoping that people wake up. Stories like this, stories like anyone who read Jordan Peterson's first book, there's 3 million and something people out there who read his first book, probably more on the secondhand market, or who's ever listened to him give a lecture. And he sought out lectures all over the country and then all over the world. These people know that these are just lies. They're just lies, and that they're saying that he's a radical, he's the darling of the alt-right, this nonsense. And people realize that it's not true. And because they realize it's not true, they realize that what is really happening is that they don't like him because, like Donald Trump once said, they don't like me because they don't like you. And what it is if you have any sort of conservative views at all, attempting to shut down people like Jordan Peterson is just an attempt to shut you down. And people are realizing it, and it's a good thing. Anyway, we're going to leave it there today. Got on my soapbox a little about the severity of the problem that is cancel culture. If anyone has any questions that they want me to answer on the podcast, I'd really like to start doing more Q&As. So I'm not going to answer questions on YouTube and Facebook anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to write down questions and then address them in the next video. I like that format a little bit better. So I might not write back as much online. I might answer them there and then read the answers on here. I haven't decided yet exactly. But I would love some more questions, more things that people would like to know, be curious about. We're going to leave it there today, though. I am Tyler Chrestman, and thanks for tuning in. We will talk again soon.